Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History webinar series. I'm Marin. I'm your host for this webinar. In way of announcements, we will be updating our next schedule for the month of May. We have 5 upcoming webinars, and I will mention those at the end of this webinar. Today's webinar will be with James Tanner. He's presenting on wars, plagues, catastrophes, and genealogy. Just a reminder, if you have any technical difficulties, you're welcome to use the chat box, and I can help you out with any of those technical problems. You also can email at fhl_webinars@byu.edu in case the chat box is not working. We'll move on to our presentation. James has over 32 years of experience in the genealogical research field and is an avid blogger of Genealogy's Star blog, and rejoice and be exceedingly glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the US and Canada. James has 7 children and 34 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. So just a reminder, we will have our question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so you can keep your questions till the end. If you'd like to comment, you can use the chat box, but if you have any questions, those will be addressed at the end of the webinar. I think that's everything. We will turn the time over to James.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. I'm glad to be here on another webinar for the Brigham Young University Family History Library. This episode is going to talk about wars, plagues, catastrophes, and genealogy. All of the good stuff, a lot of things that you probably don't think about much when you're doing genealogy, but probably should. First of all, there's a saying that says it's an ill wind that blows no one any good. And yes, it would be a very ill wind if someone didn't get some good out of it. And the interesting thing from the genealogical standpoint is that there are good things and then there are bad things. And we'll talk about the bad and the good. But for the most part, disasters do help to identify individuals and to put them into the context of where they live and what was happening to them during their lifetimes. And there's lots of other benefits from the catastrophes as far as from a genealogical standpoint. There's also some very, very serious detriments. And if we focused only on the detriments, we would not be able to benefit from all of the, of the detriments, we would not be able to benefit from the things that are good about for genealogical research. This is the main point, is that wars, plagues, and catastrophes all create records and destroy records. So those are the two sides of it. They create certain kinds of records and other kinds of records on at different occasions, depending on the plague and the war and the catastrophe are destroyed. So the question that we have to put and understand as a genealogical researcher is that our genealogical research takes place within the context of history. And this may seem like, well, yeah, that's obvious kind of thing to talk about, but the real issue is that many genealogists focus so much on the names and the dates and the places of what's happening on their family group records or the pedigree chart or whatever, that they ignore the greater view of what is happening to the people that they're recording. And so we're going to talk about how some of these different occurrences can affect not just the records, but they also affect the lives and the life and death of the people that we're trying to find and document. some of the things that happen that you'll see on as you're doing genealogical research, commonly referred to as brick walls, often unexplained problems, all these sorts of things. When we're starting to look at the greater context, the idea of an unexplained disappearance becomes just patently obvious. And as we talk about some of these events, then I'm going to point out how that might affect the records that you're seeing and why they may not agree or disagree, or you may not be able to find certain people or certain families. Another one is missing family members. A husband disappears, children disappear, anyone disappears, spouse, either husband or wife. And there just seems to be no explanation whatsoever. You just cannot find a death record. You can't find anything that really tells what happened to this person. And the reason for this may lie in this area of wars and plagues and catastrophes, because the mechanism for making and recording those types of events may not allow for recording exactly when this person died, for example. There may be thousands of people who died, and maybe only a very small part of those people actually get recorded on any kind of an official record. A missing birth, marriage, or death record could be easily explained by the fact that the records were either lost or destroyed in some fashion. And in each case, continued searching for a record, like a birth record or a marriage record or a death record, when it seems like there just is no record at all, that you can't find any mention at all of the person's birth. The answer may be there may not be one. It just may not exist anymore. It may not have been created originally, but it may have also any of the record that we could have found is simply not available or not, or was destroyed. Breaks in record sets. Many people, you'll see a list of records for a parish or for a state, or not necessarily for a state, but for a county. And they'll say records from 1870 to 1890, and then there's no records from 1890 to 1915, and then the records start up again. Any number of things could create that break, but it's often easy to understand that if you, for instance, go to the newspapers and start looking to see what might have happened in that county at the time that there was a break in the records. Perhaps the courthouse burned down, or some other catastrophe occurred that prevented or either destroyed the existing records or prevented them from being regularly maintained. In earlier records, meaning back before the middle of the 19th century, the erratic number of children and ages in a family. Many of the larger online genealogical programs will come up with an error message and say, missing children, possible missing children. Well, yeah, and they may be a good reason for having missing children, and that is that there was some epidemic that went through, and many of the children in a community may have been affected by that epidemic during any particular time. So gaps in the record may indicate that a child is missing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be a record for the missing child. Or if there is no record, there's no way to determine whether or not there was a missing child. Once again, to emphasize this, genealogy is history. It is a part of the ongoing flow of events that occur throughout the world. We often think of history as being the major players. There was one of the interesting aspects of being involved in historical research is that there are fashions and fads and things that pass through the academic communities, just like there are outside of academic communities. And history is not immune, and there are times when different types of historical records were being kept and written because of the emphasis that historians had on various aspects of what was going on around them. One of the examples of this would be history as it is emphasized through the major players. And when you have a history like that, what you get are kings and emperors and rulers and presidents, and you get all of the major generals in armies, and it's like no one else ever fought in an army, and that the general fought the entire army on his own because they don't mention anyone else except the general. This is one view of history. Well, one of the things that has been happening lately is that historians are becoming more and more aware of the need to document individual histories of individual people who aren't particularly politically, socially, economically prominent. This is really an entirely new way of doing history. And genealogy has been doing that ever since the beginning, because we focus on families and individuals rather than on only the important people. However, you have to recognize that there is a group of a faction of genealogists whose main interest is basically involved with trying to track back to royalty or track back to some famous person. You'll see this on advertising for some of the genealogical companies. Are you related to, and they'll list somebody who is supposed to be famous. I guess I'm pretty well out of the loop on a lot of those, because they say, are you related to this person? And I go, I don't even know that person. I would never heard of them. Apparently they're very famous in some way, but they're not well enough known for me to have noticed who they are. Well, if we look at genealogy as history, we have to really make a decision on our parts as to whether or not we're going to record the history as it happened with all of the people in our lines, or if we're going to spend our time trying to be connected to some more prominent ancestor. That's personal. I really have no feelings one way or the other. If that's the way, but if we do that, you're going to get a different history than if you are focusing on the families and the individuals as they appear in your pedigree. Just a quote here that might help to understand this: that people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And that's got on a couple of different levels. That's correct. That we really are, without a knowledge of our past history, we become rootless, and we become without any kind of foundation for making decisions. One of the things that I say continually in looking at news accounts of politics, of current politics, is statements made by people that are so-called prominent people, senators, congressmen, representatives, senators, of all types of people in politics and otherwise, who make statements that show that they have just absolutely no idea about the historical background of what they're talking about. They say things that are just totally devoid of any kind of contact with history. But this is something that's less than excusable in genealogical research. We should not be out there looking at our history and from the view of what we are today. People in the 1800s and 1700s did not drive cars. They did not own computers. They did not telephone each other use a telephone to telephone each other. They did not do all of these things that we do commonly today, and we shouldn't be evaluating them and their times through our modern eyes. So with no branches, no roots, you have no ancestry. Here we're going to get into some issues. I'm going to give you a list of the American wars. That is all the wars that the United States has fought, the ones we've won and the ones we haven't. We cannot be like a 400 hitter. We cannot claim that we have never never lost a war. And we can't claim that all of our wars were just and wonderful and we should have we were always on the right side of every war. I would ask you some questions if you go down through that list. Are you familiar with the time frame and the cause and the place where those particular wars were fought? I'll think about that for a moment. I'll pull up a few of these. The Creek War, that sounds like one you might not recognize. I had a group of people together at one time teaching a class, and they were adults. They were not little, they weren't little children type people. They were adults, I assumed, with some kind of basic background knowledge. And I said, made some reference. We were looking at a pedigree on a slide or overhead, and I mentioned that this person lived from 1830 to 1875 or 80 or something like that. And I said, well, they were alive during 1860 to 1865, 66. So what can we look for? And they all sat there and looked at me, and I said, wait a minute, like 1862 to, what should we be worried about here in the United States? I still couldn't get any response. Well, we'll not draw it out any longer. No, one of them had a clue. When I finally said U.S. Civil War, they all said, oh, is that when that happened? And so this is the kind of thing that puts us outside of the historical range. We can't function as genealogists and adequately document our people if we aren't aware of things like the U.S. Civil War. And we'll show you why here in just a second. So how many wars of these wars do you know about? How many could you tell me the time period, or would be able to find the time period very quickly? The glory or the advantage that we have in our modern day is that we can use the computer, Google search, or whatever search engine you use, and go in and put in the names of all these wars and immediately come up with the time frame and who it was that was fighting and why and who was involved. But the question becomes is, which of your ancestors fought in any of these wars? How many of your people were actually involved physically in the Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, whatever, or the predecessor of all of those branches of the Army in the service, going back to colonial times? How many of your people were involved in these wars? That is a really important and fundamental question that you should be asking, because each of the things that happen in these wars is that they generate valuable, and I would say in some cases invaluable, genealogical records that will help us to understand, not only just understand about the lives of our people, but clear up problems and issues such as missing records, missing data, missing people that we will not be able to resolve in any other way. And we can get into that. The next question is, where would you go to find the records of all these wars? And this brings up an important part of understanding the process of doing genealogical research, because genealogical research involves identifying records that may pertain or provide information about your ancestors and your relatives, and then identifying about where those records would be located and can be accessed. And if you think that doing genealogy has to do with searching for people and searching for names and trying to find people in large genealogy databases, you're missing the point, because the point of understanding how to work through these projects is that we need to recognize how to find the records. Where are these records located? Where are they? Um, it's almost like there's a smokescreen out there keeping us from seeing the fact that we're searching for records when the search engine on a large database says fill in the name and the date and the place and comes up with the name of your ancestor in a record that you may or may not understand where it came from or how it was generated. So this is kind of the way it is. So here's kind of a basic question about one of those wars. How many people fought and died in the US Civil War? And how did that particular number of people that were involved directly in the battles and serving in the military organizations of the time, how many, what out of what number of people would that be? How many people were living in the United States at the time of the division and the battle between the states that we call the United States Civil War? Here we go. Soldiers from the United States, 2,128,948. Soldiers from the Confederate States, 1,082,119. If you looked at those two numbers, and if they'd had those two numbers before the war began, what you would have predicted about the outcome of the war? Assuming that both sides suffered tremendous losses and casualties, who had the upper hand in this protracted war between our states? That's an open-ended question. Estimates of the war dead are from 620,000 to 850,000. Now, why are there such a big spread of numbers here for the number of people who died? Because in the mid-1800s, it was very difficult to determine the cause of death. So it was hard to say that this person died because of the war, or did they just die because they happened to be in the wrong place and a tree fell on them, or a lightning struck, or whatever. Do you count all the people who were listed as soldiers and all of those who we presume missing or dead, or do we just count the people who got shot or whatever? So there's a lot of different ways of looking at the information, but in either case, it was a horrendously large number of people who died during the war. And so if you did, and all of us had ancestors who lived during the mid-1800s, period. Now, the second question is, did any of those live in the United States? Well, many of us have ancestors who lived in the United States during the 1860s when the Civil War was fought. So how many of those of our people were in the states that could have been participants in the war? Can you answer those questions are the ones that you need to ask individually about your ancestors. If we add up all the people who have died in wars in the United States in that long list, as far as we know, it's an estimate, obviously, because there could be more, probably not less. I would guess that the estimates of those who died in the wars are underestimated, if anything. And there was about 1.2 million Americans have died in all the wars, including the colonial wars going back and the other wars that have happened. And over half of those died in the Civil War. So that's kind of the perspective that we have as to what types of damage that this might have done. Now, here's a question for those of us who are interested in records. How many records were destroyed during the United States Civil War? I cannot answer that question. I have looked into it. I've tried to determine that information. You would have to go by county, courthouse by courthouse, and make a determination if any of the records in that particular county or courthouse had been destroyed in some fashion by the military action, not through natural disasters or something else happening to the records, a fire that wasn't attributed to the war or whatever. But I would guess that there were not as many as you might think. It just seems to me that in reading long discourses about the US Civil War over my lifetime, that one fact that comes through is that, yes, there were cities that got destroyed. Yes, there were counties that got burned a bit, quite a bit. And there were other buildings such as courthouses and things that were burned or destroyed. But overall, looking at the entire country of the United States of America, there were lots of areas where no records were affected at all. And for example, and it's a bad example, I'm going to give you a bad example. A bad example is my ancestors, immediate ancestors. Out of all of my ancestors, there was only one person that actually fought in the Civil War. And the rest of them had absolutely nothing to do with it because they lived in the western part of the United States by the 1860s. So even though there were some battles and things done in the Civil War in the western part of the United States, they did not necessarily affect any records, and they didn't affect the people that much, other than the fact that they were losing their relatives in the war that was happening at the other side of the country. Okay, how many of your relatives have fought and or died in a war? This is a question that should be asked by every genealogist. We should be able to go back and determine this. There's some prestige, obviously, about learning that one of your ancestors was functioned during the American Revolutionary War. One of my ancestors, one of my in my surname family, in the Tanner family, was commended by the Continental Congress and the Continental Army because he lent one of his slaves to the war effort. And I don't know whether you consider that to be fought or died in a war, but that was the kind of record that that occurred. So there are whole organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution and others that simply exist because of people who are interested in tracing their ancestors back to fighting in either the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, or one of the other major conflicts in the past. So what are the challenges to genealogists? First of all is realizing the reality of war. The war is terribly destructive. It involves lots of people, and the results are often that people die in the middle of the war. Within the last week and a half to 2 weeks, I have been involved in doing research in a family where the husband died in the Civil War. So this is a reality that we need to be cognizant of, that we can realize as we're doing our research. When we find people living in the certain time period, whether it be in the United States or in other countries, if we're aware of where the conflicts were, that may immediately present not only another set of records to research, but also an explanation for some of the things that I mentioned at the beginning. So one of the things that we need to research is how the war may have affected your ancestors, our ancestors. Did they lose property? Did they move? Did they migrate to a different country because of war? Did they go, were they involved in the war somehow? Regardless of which side of the conflict they were happened to be on. And another, once again, challenge for the genealogical researcher is locating and searching those records. It would be wonderful if there was one place in the world where all the military records were stored. That doesn't happen. And as a matter of fact, they are scattered all over the United States in libraries, archives, museums, and historical societies. For example, you may have had an ancestor who fought in World War I or World War II. One of the things that I have found over doing research over the years is that almost without exception, every unit who fought in either World War I or World War II has a unit history. Where are those unit histories? And if you're looking carefully and you keep searching and searching for those histories, you start to learn more about the unit and where it was based and where the men were trained and all of that kind of information. And what you'll find is that they are probably mostly available in libraries and museums associated with the larger military bases in the United States. So if your ancestor fought in World War II and was in the artillery corps or the infantry or the armored corps, if they fought in a tank, their records might be, if they were in a tank, they might be in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and the museum and library that's maintained there at the base. Are you going to be able to find them on the internet? Probably. If you do enough research, you'll find some reference to where the record might be located, or even an entire copy of the record of the history of that particular unit. From a personal standpoint, my grandfather fought in World War I, and he also fought on what's called the Border War. I don't think that was even listed on that list, but it's the Mexican border conflict war. But the Mexican War and the World War I had extreme difficulty finding any reference to his unit. The reason I knew his unit was because he had a veteran's headstone that was supplied by the government, and it listed his unit. That unit didn't show up anywhere. And basically, after having done a lot of research, I determined that his unit was not a U.S. Army unit. He was in a National Guard unit that was mobilized and became part of a Texas National Guard unit that was then shipped to Europe to fight in World War I. And so ultimately we were able to find that information and find the history of that unit, but otherwise it was not easily or identified or available for that matter. Okay, we're going to shift a little bit into another gear here. What is a plague? Well, a plague is an epidemic disease causing a high rate of mortality. There really isn't any one kind of plague, although we have named some of the diseases plagues. Plague is a particular disease and is identified. In fact, if those of you out there may be surprised to know that plague is still commonly an infectious disease throughout the world, and particularly right here in the United States. There's many parts of Arizona and southern Utah where the rodents, the smaller animals, including rabbits and rats and mice and etc., have plague. And were you to come in contact with one of those animals or its various kinds of products, you could get the plague. And people do from time to time in Arizona and in southern Utah do end up getting the plague. So it's not something of the past. It's still around. It's just not causing an epidemic of high mortality rate at the present time. So have we had any American plagues or epidemics? And I'm sure those of you who have read history and know a little bit of history, or a lot of history, or can memorize stuff and have just all these dates right off the top of your head, you probably know that there have been some major epidemics in the United States and previously in the American. One thing you might be interested, if you are interested in the early history of the Americas, back during colonial and pre-colonial days, if you've ever wondered why and how a very few settlers from Europe on the eastern coast of the United States were essentially able to establish themselves and move across the country and subdue, kill the native population without any kind of an apparent opposition. And the answer is very simple, and this is not something that is commonly taught in schools, but it is becoming more and more accepted as the reality of that time period, and that is that when the diseases European diseases were brought to America, those diseases wiped out different estimates, anywhere up to 90% of all of the population of the natives that lived here in the on America, on the North and South America. And so all the Europeans were actually confronted with when they arrived was a remnant population of people whose customs and tribal structure and all other parts of their culture had been decimated by disease. So when has this ever affected us in the United States? During the time that we've been here, obviously, yes, or I wouldn't have brought it up. We had the big Spanish flu, what was called the Spanish flu, because that was where the first major cases were detected of epidemic, and it says it's in 1918, and that's the date that is usually given for the epidemic, although it started before that and continued after that, and there have been subsequent epidemics of flu across various parts of the world. Kind of as a side note, both my wife and I have had the flu, which is a respiratory disease. Some people generalize the term flu to mean all sorts of other ailments, but the flu, as was the cause of this epidemic, is a terrible disease, and all I can say is when I was in the midst of having the flu, I could certainly understand how people died from it. It's a terrible disease. 50 million people died worldwide. Now that had a pretty substantial impact on genealogical records and whether or not you can find an individual. So if you're thinking you're looking and you've got a brick wall or whatever you want to call it, a place where you can't find your individuals and they were living at around the time of 1918, you might start investigating whether or not they died of the flu, or whether members of their family died of the flu and they moved or went someplace else rather than to live where all their family had died, and things like that. Those are the things that need. And so there were also 650,000 Americans who died from the 1918 flu epidemic. You'll look at that number and you'll see that that's fairly close to the number of people that died a few years earlier in the American Civil War. So we have quite a bit of people that are passing on. So it was actually from 1916 to 18. Everybody's lives were affected by the flu, whether or not they got the flu, whether or not members of their family died, whether they died, whatever happened, they were still affected because of the way that all of the countries of the world reacted to the flu being such a contagious disease. And remember this, World War I was going on at the same time. Oh yeah, that's another thing. And 37 million people died in World War I. So if you add those two together, there were 87 million people who died in that time period from around 1913, 14, 15, 16 through 1918, 19, before the flu epidemic went down and before they wound up the battles of World War I. And the chances are, when you start talking about these large numbers, is that your ancestors were affected just as many others were. Well, what about disasters? Let's see what we call a disaster. 1900 Galveston hurricane killed 6,000 to 12,000. There were 6,000 to 12,000 fatalities. Once again, the number, a varying number, is from the low to the high is very great, almost double. And the reason was, if you have ever heard anything or seen anything about this the Galveston Island hurricane, is that there was just nothing left above ground on Galveston Island when the hurricane ended, and that there was no way to tell whether people died or didn't die from the hurricane. There was another 1899 hurricane that had 3,300 plus fatalities, the San Ciriaco hurricane. Maybe you've not heard of that one. 1906, the San Francisco earthquake had 3,000 plus fatalities. Again, it's another situation where the number of people killed could not be determined. There was no way at the time of knowing who lived there and who they could not find after the earthquake occurred. And then the September 2001, September 11th attack on the World Trade Center had almost 3,000 fatalities, 2,996, and it's still a major event issue in the memories and lives of people who probably had currently had no other contact with a disaster of that magnitude. We also have the Johnstown flood back in 1889, when over 2,000 people were killed. And this, once again, is an estimate, because many of the bodies of the people were not recovered, and many of the people who were killed were simply not recorded or reported as fatalities. So were any of your ancestors in the middle of these or any of the other disasters, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, all of these different things that can happen? And maybe the fact that you don't have any records in a particular time period have to do with the fact that there was a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake. And so maybe learning some history would help you to understand and put all of this into perspective. Lately, I've been having a fair amount of back and forth about the Mayflower. Yesterday, I actually talked to some people here in the BYU Family History Library and said, "Can I help you?" And the first question they asked me is, "How do I find my Mayflower ancestor?" And of course, I came back and told them exactly where they could go to find the books, and we'd made a little field trip and got the books for them. And then I went through their pedigree on that they were to the person they were supposedly connected to, and determined rather quickly that they had a lot of work to do on their lines before they could claim that they were descendants of the Mayflower, which is not uncommon. But what happened to the 45 of the 102 Mayflower passengers died in the winter of 1620 and 1621 and did not have descendants? So if you subtract 45 from 102, you have the number of passengers who survived long enough to have had some descendants. And so that's the group of people that they're focusing on. Now, here's another question. What are burned counties? Now, a burned county is, it's a term of art. It is actually the way that we refer to these. And these are the counties throughout the United States where the courthouse has been burned at some point or another, either once or twice or 3 or 4. You'd think they'd learn after a while, but there really are counties where they've had multiple fires that have burned down multiple courthouse structures. This is sometimes used as an excuse for not doing any research. I have people who say, oh, I can't do any research on that line because all my ancestors' records were lost in a fire when the courthouse burned. Well, that isn't even possibly true, and it isn't even logical from the standpoint of history. There are records, every record, valuable records that are lost when the courthouse burns. There are major courthouse fires that destroy more than just a few records, that destroy everything. But many of those records have to be reconstructed. I usually ask this question if somebody says, oh, well, all the records in my ancestors were destroyed in the courthouse and wherever. And so I can't do any research. And my answer always said, boy, I envy your ancestors. And he says, well, why should you envy my ancestors? And my answer back is, oh, they didn't ever have to pay any real estate taxes or any other taxes in the county, did they? And they look at me and say, well, why would that be the case? And I said, well, if all the records were burned, how did they tax the people? How did they know who owned what land? And the answer to that is very simple. The burned courthouse records do not all had to be reconstructed. The county would have ceased to exist as a county if they didn't go back and figure out who owned the land, so they could do some tax the people on the real estate. So this is if you start thinking about this kind of context, you realize that, yeah, records were destroyed. Yes, some of the records you may want were destroyed, but not all the records were destroyed. And there certainly were lots of other records in that county that were not destroyed in a courthouse, such as church records, such as school records perhaps were not kept in the courthouse, many other records out there, farm records, other things that have nothing to do with courthouses. So a burned county is a county where the courthouse was burned, and they use it as an excuse for not doing research. And actually, it should be a reason for doing more research. You should be doing more research and looking at more records. Just because there is a burned county does not mean there aren't any. It just means they're not going to be as easily found as it might have been. And there are strategies for finding records in burned counties, and there are probably a huge number. I've seen lots and lots of articles and books even that talk about strategies for finding records in the burned counties. A good place to start with that is the FamilySearch.org research wiki. On FamilySearch.org, go to search and look for the wiki, and then put in burned counties, and you'll get a list of all of the counties that have been burned, and you'll be able to get some strategies there on what to do about it. Now we got to think about something that's a little bit different here. What if your own records were lost? Let's say you're the type of person that's been accumulating genealogical records for years, and what would happen if those records were lost? How would that affect you, and how would that affect what research you've done? I would suggest that the question to ask is, what have you done to preserve your own records? What is it that you've done that would ensure that the records that you have are not, that you've accumulated for your lifetime, will not be destroyed? So think about which records would be lost from what you've done if your house burned down. Would all of your genealogical records be lost if your house burned down? What about if there was a natural disaster in your area? What if you were subject to the fires that occurred this past year or so in California or other places? What if you were in Texas or in Louisiana when one of the big hurricanes came through, or Florida? What if you were any other places that where there are tornadoes or other things? What if you died in an epidemic? What would happen to your records? We sometimes think that we're immune to all this, but that's not the way it works. But I could suggest that there's hope out there. And the hope is that millions of records are being digitized every year. It's far less likely that records will be destroyed by any of these particular factions. Now, before somebody gets really upset and starts sending me notes about how easy it is to lose digitized records and how these digitized records are just as vulnerable as any other records. And the answer to that is, of course they are. They're just in a different place. So the idea here of preserving records, the first basic idea of the records is don't have all your records in the same location. If your house burns down, make sure you've got copies of all your records someplace else. What are the chances that both you and wherever you have your records is going to get burned down? Well, it's possible. So have it 3 places. And the answer is just keep adding places as depending on how you view and what you view as the risk factor and how serious that might be of how all of these records, all of your records could be lost. And I would suggest that we would want to digitize our own records. These records are valuable enough to do all this research on. They're valuable enough to spend the same as an additional time and digitize them all. Get out your camera, get out your scanner, get out wherever you'd like to be. Put in a plug here for the Brigham Young University Family History Library. We have an amazing array of wonderful scanning and photographic reproduction and all sorts of book scanners and all sorts of equipment here that patrons can use to digitize their own records. And usually on the Sunday afternoons when we're open, that is something that is ongoing and extremely obvious that there's lots of people out there digitizing a lot of their photographs and other records. Okay, well, that sort of covers the subject for today, and I would thank all of you for watching and remind you that this is the Brigham Young University Family History Library, and we have these videos and webinars are being uploaded regularly to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, and encourage you to subscribe to the channel. We're getting quite a number of subscriptions, and I appreciate those who thank us for the videos. We're very happy to have the opportunity to present these videos for the genealogical community. And thanks again for watching.
All right, we'll open the time now to questions. You can type those into the chat box, and then I'll just read those out and James will answer them.
Chat.
All right, if there are any questions for James, I'll just move on to announcements. So next month, we have a couple of webinars coming up. We have a webinar on May 2nd, so that'll be next Thursday at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Catherine Grant will be giving a presentation on double trouble, avoiding the same name trap, how to tell the difference between different records that seem to be the same person. So that'll be next Thursday at 3 p.m. And with Catherine Grant. If you joined our webinar late, that's not a problem. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube page and on our website, and that will be updated no later than Monday next week. Since the semester here at BYU is over, videos will be getting updated a lot faster. I'm working here full time during spring summer, so there's going to be a lot more work done in the webinar section of the BYU Family History Library. And on May 9th, we have another webinar with James Tanner. The following week after that, on May 16th, we'll be hearing from Lisa Arnold. And then after that, we'll be hearing from Joe Price and then Angelina Sinikis. So that's all the webinars for May, and we hope that you'll join us next week to hear from Catherine Grant. If you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to email at fhl_webinars@byu.edu. Thank you and have a wonderful weekend.